Welcome to the Mindfulness and Meditation Summit, a free online event where you'll receive heartfelt guidance from leaders in the mindfulness field to help you fortify and balance mind, body, and spirit. Share this powerful event with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now your host, Kaira Lingo.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us, and I'm very happy to introduce our special guest today, Sensei Kritee Kanko. Kritee, whose Dharma name is Kanko, is a climate scientist, a Zen priest, a grief ritual leader, educator, and a co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center. Dearest Kritee, it is such a great pleasure to have you joining us today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. My pleasure. It's so lovely to see you.
So Kritee, you've generously come to share today about how we can create islands of sanity in a sea of chaos. And I know this is such an important topic for us to look at in these times. If you could share a little bit from your perspective as a Rinzai Zen priest who's teaching meditation, why have you become a proponent of grief circles or grief rituals?
Yeah, such a deep question. Thank you. It is absolutely true that traditional Buddhist practice has not focused on emotions too much, be it the early Buddhist practices or the later Mahayana practices, which Rinzai Zen is a part of. Our focus in Buddhism, from which mindfulness movement derives, has been on investigation of the ego and dissolution of the ego. And the kind of trauma that exists in the world now didn't exist at the time of historical Buddha. We have had 2,500 years of layers of trauma accumulated in human psyche now. I want to say some numbers. We don't have to pay attention on the numbers, but the significance will be clear as I say them. 1 in 5 children in United States have been sexually molested. 1 in 4 human beings in this country have been beaten to the point of having a mark on their bodies. 1/8 of kids have seen their mothers being physically beaten up. You see, we could keep going. 1 in 4 have alcoholic relatives. If you just imagine, this is just United States, if we just multiply it by what's happening in other countries where there is systemic racism, systemic caste system, you can just imagine, visualize a planet full of either people who are traumatized themselves or are dealing with someone who's traumatized. Yeah? So the traditional Buddhist goal of dissolving the ego so we can serve the world with compassion and wisdom cannot happen in today's world, in my view and view of many other wise wizards and witches that I know of, if we don't take care of that trauma. See? So the question of why grief work, if we don't release that pressure, that stress, that trauma that has built up in our collective psyche and our individual bodies, how will we lighten up and be able to dissolve our ego and experience the sense of interconnection and interbeing that we are? So I see trauma release through grief circles or community grief rituals as an integral part of our Buddhist or mindfulness practice. Yeah. I mean, that's like the initial barrier that I think we really need to work through. And, we have so many educated, extremely well-trained psychologists in this country, but the amount of trauma we face cannot be met by those brilliant psychotherapists in one-on-one sessions. That's why community rituals.
What's coming up for me is this understanding that as long as we have this trauma that's unhealed, there's a fundamental lack of safety in ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Why do you place emphasis on creating communities, as you said, the grief work, creating communities that focus both on inner healing and strategic outer change?
Yeah, if there is one phrase that I would like to keep coming back to is this integration of inner and outer change work. Most of the activists in all age groups that I speak to, young or old, it's a typical reaction that after just a few weeks, or in some cases months, or maybe if you're tenacious, years, people get utterly burnt out by mainstream activist culture because there is a lot of shame and blame going on. Yeah. And it's constantly creating the other in people who don't share our views. This is someone who doesn't believe in climate crisis, or this is someone who doesn't believe in racial justice, and here I am, the better one. And it creates a lot of stress. It adds to the layers of trauma that we talked about in the previous question. So the activists need to ground themselves, to do their grief work, to release their trauma, to show up in an open-hearted way to change the world, to be the change makers that we so desperately need on a consistent, ongoing basis. It's not like you worked hard for a few months and you got burnt out and depressed, and then you just want to just have energy to take care of your own health, right? On the other hand, I'm sure the audience here has experienced being in yoga and meditation and mindfulness communities where we spend endless hours in silence on the cushion, or going to retreats, and our inner change is just not getting reflected in how we view these systems in the world, systems of oppression. And all the goodwill and compassion and kindness that we generate in our meditation practice, mindfulness practice, it's a pity that it doesn't get sharpened by the realities of the world. It's just like we miss an opportunity to deepen our spiritual work, deepen our mindfulness practice, because we are just using it to take care of issues that privileged world faces. We are not looking into the analogy that comes to my mind is the knife is as sharp as things you're trying to cut with it. So if we don't apply our mindfulness to systemic problems, it's just like we're not getting all the juice out of it, not getting its brilliance, tapping into all of its brilliance. So I feel that integration of inner and outer change is just absolutely crucial in these times.
Thank you. That is such an important statement, and it makes me think of the relationship between inner and outer trauma that you started talking about at the beginning. And Thomas Hubel was sharing on a summit on trauma, online summit, about that we live basically in societies that are expressions of unhealed intergenerational trauma, like our institutions themselves, the way people are treated and children are treated in schools, the way we're looked at as consumers. That comes from a tradition of intergenerational trauma that just got passed from one generation to the next to the next. So it's so clear what you're saying, that in order to manifest new, truly healing systems in society, that has to be our inner work has to be integrally connected to that, in both directions. Thank you for naming that. So speaking of healing, inner and outer, you are on the recovering side of COVID-19. Would you share what you've learned from your own sickness? And can you talk about the pain, the fears, the anxieties that you yourself faced?
Yeah, I'm still integrating this experience. Today is like day 50 from the time my symptoms began to appear. And so there is definitely physical, deep physical exhaustion in my body. And we did have 2 weeks of keeping our bag ready to go to emergency room for 2 weeks. And it required me to use all the tools that I know of to watch the rising of my own anxiety and my body tightening up, and watching my husband and his body language get tighter. So there was definitely a lot of anxiety, and talk about possibility of death. And it made me, we always say in Buddhist practice that we are practicing to be able to face old age, sickness, and death. The traditional practice in Buddhist circles always come back to those 3 words: old age, sickness, and death. And the fear of facing those things is a profound teacher. I think I cannot imagine when people don't have those tools, how much that anxiety becomes, just self-escalating. Because after I got sick myself, I was documenting herbs and medicines and healing practices that helped me, and that my list of things brought me in touch with many other COVID patients. I was just blown away by the amount of paranoia and fear that is around us. It was like people have never thought about death, and the possibilities just absolutely freaking us out. And death is something as natural as birth, but somehow we hide it so well that it's just been mind-boggling for me. So I've been very grateful for all the training in grief work and meditation that, and my study of neurobiology of trauma. I applied that on myself in real time, and I think I avoided going to emergency room for 45 days, because I had those practices, because there were many moments where it felt like my lungs are collapsing, the initial visceral response. Oh, my heart, my chest hurts so much on the left side. but you use a few minutes of grounding practices and it was like, no, this is okay.
Say more about these grounding practices that came to your aid. Describe what you would do to meet this real fear.
I didn't start by counting those steps, but they came down to 5 steps for me. Initial step was always slow down. Whatever you are thinking or doing, slow down, sit down, take a few deep, long breaths, and at least 10. I made that a thumb rule for myself, especially long exhalations, which are supposed to calm our, fight and flight mind. Once I calm down, I try to access as step 2 what I called safe memories. These are memories of people and places that have been kind to me. Just thinking about the smell of my mother cooking food, like even now, it's just like my body sensations change. And once you access the state, those safe memories clearly, I have a process of imagining the smell, the sound, the touch deeply. Then I allow myself, and sometimes it happens naturally, sometimes I ask myself that question. What does this safe memory mean in today's times? My mother is not with me. I'm separated from her. She's in India and I don't know when I will see her next. Oh gosh, that brings up grief because there is profound love. So depending on the situation, I would either tap into the grief or I would tap into the love, and they are the same thing. Grief, love. I call it grief, love. We don't grieve unless we love very profoundly. Yeah. So I tap into that grief, love, and reinterpret that grief in those few minutes. And, the physical reality around me hasn't changed, but my mind shifts from fight, flight, and freeze mode of operation to a more grounded, connected self. It's like, okay, this is not the best situation I could be in, but I can take the action that's required of me. So, starts with grounding and slowing down, accessing safe memory, accessing grief and love, and just integrating it. I hope that makes sense. Somehow has
Definitely
worked with me repeatedly.
That's really beautiful to hear. Also, this understanding of grief, love being the same thing. That's so important because it helps to, for me, it helps to see grief with more of an open heart rather than, oh, this is something I don't want. But no, this is a manifestation of my love. So important. So you've been speaking to this already, but I'd like to ask you, in the larger sense, what grounds you in the midst of so much pain and suffering these days? Not just the pandemic, but the larger. I mean, we're in a larger pandemic. If we look clearly, the COVID-19 is a mini, microcosm of the larger macrocosm of decades of pandemic that we are coming from and heading into even more intensely. So what questions are you still wrestling with as a climate justice advocate? And how do you ground yourself given, just the immensity of what we're facing?
What comes up for me right now is, first, I just want to acknowledge, honestly, that sometimes I am not grounded. Sometimes it feels groundless. The enormity of the current crisis, and as you say, how this crisis, which looks enormous to people all over the world, is just a little tiny blip in our trajectory, right? Sometimes it feels groundless and I don't really know what will help. But where my hope is that this pandemic, and where my hope comes from is this pandemic is bringing to light the injustices, the unwholesome habits and vulnerabilities that have existed in our society for millennia. And as much as this pandemic and the larger ecological crisis and social justice crisis, they are revealing our unwholesome ways of being, especially in the privileged and white world in the United States. They are also, they can also be doorways to change. They are presenting these unprecedented opportunities. And I derive hope from people who are asking these right questions and pushing for systemic change. One of the most beautiful things that has come out in this process, and I look at that news every time I am feeling groundless, is these large number of mutual aid networks that have popped up organically. No governments, no centralized leadership. And it's just like neighbors or people in a city helping people who need food, groceries, medicine, donating their oxygen meters to each other and sharing, when the experts are not available to help us, like doctors and nurses, who, in spite of all their best efforts, don't have all the answers we need because this disease is so new. People are sharing their ancestral knowledge. Hey, turmeric works. Hey, mullein works. And we have such deep, utter dependence on experts. And I'm an expert myself on climates, in climate science. And, I hope no one will want to put away all of my expertise. But I think there is a sense of empowerment which is also happening in these deeply disempowering times, because communities are coming together to look at these hard questions if they are not paralyzed by trauma and fear, right? So that continues to ground me both right now and in this larger ecological and social justice crisis trajectory that we are on.
Thank you. It's so important to touch into the power of community, is what I'm hearing, right? That there's so much wisdom when we turn towards each other. And it's empowering to know that, whether we're an expert or not in something, we have wisdom from our own lived experience that can deeply enrich others. And I just want to say, if it's all right, it would be lovely to include links to your understandings of what's been helpful for COVID-19 for the audience to tap that you've collected and all that you've experienced yourself, including, the traditional Ayurvedic Indian wisdom that you've tapped into as well. So, you've been talking about what creates health. This session is on islands of sanity in the midst of insanity. Can you speak about that concept of islands of sanity, and why is that concept so important to you?
When I think about climate crisis, it's not necessarily a view of mainstream climate movement yet, but a lot of us beginning to realize that even with best of our efforts, actually it is mainstream understanding now that even with best of our efforts, we will still lose a lot of people, a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of species. The best case scenario of just changing the global temperature by 2 degrees Celsius will mean a lot of suffering for a lot of people and species. So you can almost imagine, visualize that the sea levels are rising and coastal cities are underwater, or even if they are not constantly underwater, they get flooded more often. So there is the psychological sea of insanity, but there is a physical rising, which is very likely as well, physical rising of the oceans. And it's being caused by utter madness, right? Utter systemic delusion and greed. So insanity is there everywhere. When I have thought about what gives me hope, what keeps me relatively grounded, functional, so I can express my compassion and wisdom, this image of islands of sanity has come up. And after that phrase come to me, I have found that it has been around in the literature since 2018 or 17, I believe. I'm forgetting name of the person, Margaret Weasley? Someone also...
Margaret Wheatley.
Margaret Wheatley also wrote about it, but maybe I heard about it through her somehow, but I don't remember that. What I remember is that a couple of years ago, I found myself honing into this concept. And for me, islands of sanity means these small communities, neighborhood level or maybe city level, which are able to do 3 things simultaneously in an integrated way. Number 1 is inner change with focus on grief work for releasing trauma and meditation practices, right? So that we have trauma resilience. In these pandemic times and in these times of ongoing ecological crisis, we will keep facing more and more trauma, cultural trauma, trauma induced by extreme events. So we need that, number 1. Number 2, we need to be living our lives in ways, we call it community uplift in some circles, where we learn to live with a lot more sharing that we currently do, so that everyone doesn't need a land more. I mean, everyone doesn't actually need a lot of grass, but if you have grass, we don't necessarily all need a land more. A neighborhood can be sharing a land more, and that will have huge impact on our carbon footprint and our water footprint and what we ask of Mama Earth and all the species, right? So living in ways that support all life, not just human life, not just life of our caste and class, people of our race. Number 3, resistance. The systemic greed is so prevalent. We have to learn to say no in addition to learning to say yes to things that heal us and make us whole as a community. And in my view, unless these 3 things are integrated, inner change with systemic outer change, with changing our lifestyle, it's like the table can't stand unless it has at least 3 legs. So I call it 3 pillars of islands of sanity. There is a very famous book in Zen tradition called 3 Pillars of Zen. I feel that we badly need these 3 pillars of islands of sanity these days.
Thank you, Kritee. So, Kritee, you've said in your work on Islands of Sanity that the number 5 to 7 is quite important. Could you say a little more about why that specific number as far as gathering with others?
Absolutely. Actually, I want to say something more about that number. Research has consistently shown that if we try to operate at very large levels, especially for us people who value compassion more than authority and loyalty, it's very important for us to work in this size of 5 to 8 people, because this is where maximum number of we can sustain those relationships in a deep way, do our grief work, and take our actions together. So when we get too large, a number of reasons it just doesn't work. These small islands of sanity can be talking to each other, be communicating with each other, but the core unit has to be that size for some reason.
Sure. And if people watching today wanted to find out more about doing this, creating islands of sanity, getting support, is there a place where they could go to for more information?
So there are 2 resources on our website, boundlessinmotion.org. And one is a YouTube talk that I gave a few months ago, which describes Islands of Sanity in some detail. And the other is this zine we call of Yet to Be Named Network. So you might find descriptions. We don't use the words Islands of Sanity in this zine, Yet to Be Named Network zine, but it uses some of the same principles.
Beautiful. So encouraging all of us to go to boundlessinmotion.org. So Kritee, we're coming to the end of our time, and given what you've shared, which has been so rich and so important, what's one thing you'd like to leave us with today, or a next step that listeners can do to make changes in their own lives?
What comes up is, let's be authentic and talk to our friends and family. about what we are really feeling. We can't probably have a good heart-to-heart conversation with some people, and that's because of extent of trauma they might have or we might have. But if we slow down, really have some courage to experience that anxiety. It takes courage to experience it. We are so used to numbing our emotions. My grief ritual teachers, Joanna Macy and Beth Garrigus, they always say we've gotten addicted to numbing ourselves down. And we numb ourselves both to grief, both to trauma and to joy. And so, first step, slow down. Mindfulness practices help. Talk, because without talking, without authentically relating to each other with vulnerability, we will not be able to form communities that we so badly need. One of the things I like to say is that the systems around us are so greedy and corrupted, one individual can't change a system. To change a system, it's going to take another system. And we don't form that system without communication, authentic vulnerability. And once we have a community, then explore some of these deeper questions of how do we be responsible citizens of this planet, not of a country, but of a planet. I'm from India, and there are so many issues related to our life, policy, politics in United States. But when I think about what happens in India, I'm heartbroken. In just this COVID crisis, when Indian government announced its lockdown, close to 200 million human beings, right? You can imagine that's like 2/3 of American population. They were immediately rendered jobless. They didn't have food. They live on daily wages. And they had nowhere to go. There were lines and lines of thousands of people in a few square miles trying to find buses, or some of these migrant workers started walking hundreds and thousands of kilometers from one place to another to go home. Home. Means in that world, social distancing is a privilege. What am I saying here? What I'm saying is that we are being called to be authentic and vulnerable in our relationships with a few people to form our community so we can have a system that can oppose systemic injustices all over the world. If we can take that first step of grounding ourselves, connecting authentically with our friends or family, we will have more sense of empowerment to question, why are 200 million people walking across a country? What can I do about it? If we don't ask these questions, I like to say, how are we human? Being human means love. How are we loving towards all life on the planet? Let's bring our mindfulness to biggest crisis of the times. That's what we are being called to do. Otherwise, we are just numbing ourselves day after day, distracting ourselves. That's not being fully alive. There are no perfect answers. Fumble every day. I fumble every day. But if we are not even able to keep those questions in our mind, that'd be just too sad.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much, Kritee. This is such a inspiring and enriching call to engagement and to sustaining ourselves in the process of engaging. So I just feel this has been so incredibly nourishing and empowering to hear you today. And yeah, thank you for this very powerful session. And yeah, thank you for being with us, and thank you all for listening.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really been an honor, and you had such beautiful questions that brought out the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kritee. Thank you all.
Thank you for joining the Mindfulness and Meditation Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit mindfulnessmeditationsummit.com. To learn more about our global programs to support you in waking up in all the areas of your life and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing these resilience-building practices with your friends and family.